everyone, to this episode of Smarter Sourcing. My name is John Pavia, and today we are joined by Duncan Scott, Senior Vice President of Strategic Sourcing and Quality at New Balance. Duncan, thanks for doing this.
Hey, really glad to be here, John. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I look forward to connecting with your guests out there in Radio Land.
I've been looking forward to this one. I'm a sneaker geek from way back. I going way back to I remember getting my first high top Converse All-Stars way back when, like 69. But you are in a cutthroat space. And I love that at the very end of your title, it's sourcing and quality. So just if you could give us an idea of what your role is, and especially with respect to quality, because I know as someone who's bought a million sneakers, there are moments, many moments, I'm sure other people have said the same thing. How much of a difference is there in one sneaker, one brand to the other? You see running shoes, tennis shoes, walking shoes, and then the different brands. So, when I see sourcing and quality, I'm really interested to hear you describe your role.
Sure. Yeah. So I have a broad role at New Balance, and the two areas that I mainly cover are strategic sourcing. So strategic sourcing covers finished goods, finished footwear, finished apparel, as well as the materials that go into those. So my overall team is involved in sourcing those in a traditional way. I also have strategic purchasing, which is a little bit different. We do indirect purchasing. We probably won't talk about that too much today, but that's goods and services. So we're negotiating contracts for IT and store fixtures and other things not related to finished product. And then on the quality side, my team in Asia is responsible really from the receiving end of development of new prototypes all the way through the commercialization of those products, and then finally packing them up and shipping them off. So that's the quality piece. And we're very, very closely involved in reviewing initial designs to make sure that we're meeting kind of the needs of design for cutting edge products, but at the same time producing something that we know is going to be a quality product. And then the quality role is a little bit broader than that in the sense that we look at quality of product and also quality of process. So my team is constantly reviewing quality processes, and we take a Lean Six Sigma approach into trying to optimize our processes to make sure we have good process capability to produce a consistent product reliably. And that product is typically finished goods, as I mentioned, but it's also other services that we provide.
I want to come back to that because I don't talk about that enough on this show. And I think in general, people forget about, process improvements when it comes to efficiency. So New Balance, I didn't even know this, and I doubt most people know. It's been around since 1906. That's amazing, especially in an industry where, I consider, and maybe it's not, but I consider the sports apparel, especially the sneaker industry, a cutthroat industry. We've seen lots of other brands come and go, and the big guys just, they either gobble them up or they stomp on them. You guys been around since 1906. Is the sneaker industry and the sports apparel industry as cutthroat as I assumed it is?
I would say it's very cutthroat, and I can say that with the angle of probably almost 40 years in the industry now. It's a tough industry, and you see players come and go. You've seen a couple of the juggernauts like Nike and Adidas, top of the charts for a long time, but I'm old enough to remember when Nike was the number 2 brand, not only globally, but in the US. So I worked for Reebok back in the late 80s and early 90s, and they were actually ahead of Nike. Nike's had a good run, but I think it's a tough business, and it's a combination of performance athletic business, and also there's a fashion element. So the fashion element always means you got to have a lot of ebb and flow. You're going to have a lot of different ideas, and it makes it super challenging. I think the leaders in the industry have one thing in common, which is that they're serious about athletic performance. And as long as they're remaining on the cutting edge, it can be competitive. And New Balance, in a quiet way, since its inception, since the early days, has been dedicated to that consumer and making great product. And I think we've always done that. Sometimes we've done it, as I said, a little bit quietly, a little bit under the radar. But we're having a moment now as we've gained a lot in popularity over the few years, connected with younger consumers. And I think between the authenticity that we bring as a long-term brand, the 1906 days were really making products and inserts for workers that were working in the factories in New England in, the 1900s. And then we transitioned to making sport performance product. And in the 1970s, really took off as a running brand. And, we like to think we've always been one of the very, very top elite running brands. And we branched out into other sports. We're circling back to some of those sports and re-entering things like tennis with Coco Gauff and basketball with Kawhi Leonard and other superstars now. So we have that authenticity to say that we've been doing this for decades. But at the same time, you have to back it up with great quality product every day. And that is a challenge to stay on the cutting edge.
This isn't a marketing program, but it really is one of those industries where the marketing of it, the celebrities, the athletes that you have endorsing your brand, wearing your sneakers, wearing your apparel, man, it is so important. But it must then have an impact on what you're sourcing, especially when all of a sudden you're gonna, I do know that there is a science to this too, especially when it comes to sneakers. And all of a sudden you're going to change something about the make of the sneaker. It then affects who you're sourcing from, correct? And who your critical vendors are. So that means you're reacting to a lot of that, correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, my background, I got into this business partly because I was a really avid runner. I was a mass state champion 2-miler back in the day when it was a lot easier than it is today. And that led me to a career at University at Cornell. I also ran track. So I got into this because I was really fascinated with the products and trying to make products better. So I got into development early on. And yeah, you develop relationships with key suppliers, but they're highly specialized. And I think that's one of the things that makes our business unique. If you look at the scale that we're sourcing at now, we have calls every day, like many of you out there, from companies that want to use AI to drive down more efficient sourcing. But really, we're in a highly specialized business. Most of what is out there doesn't really help us with that specialty element of what we're trying to do. And again, to stay on the cutting edge of materials is so critical for our business. And so that makes it pretty unique. And in some cases, we have very long relationships with suppliers like Hao or others that are big players in the industry, but we have 40-year relationships with them because they are also evolving and dedicated to this. And then in other cases, we bring on new innovators that are bringing either new technology or new process technology. So if you look at the automation that some of our suppliers are getting into now, again, it's cutting edge. We do follow, there are trends that are following in materials science and things like mold making. So we watch the auto industry and the electronics industry pretty closely. And sometimes they are pioneering new technologies which are not yet at a level where we can adopt them simply because of cost. But we know that 3 years, 5 years down the road, we're going to be able to use those. So that's another way we sort of keep on the forefront of technology. And as you said, we're changing constantly because we're watching the trends and we're trying to anticipate where we need to go a little bit down the road. So it's fun that way.
I guess my where I wanted to go with this was I actually want to go back because I read about your involvement in track and running while you were in college. But what I didn't get is, was there a moment or was there something that I knew you were a competitive runner, and was there something that happened that really drove you to get into the science of the sneaker and the quality of the shoe and one brand versus another?
Yeah, I think it's a natural thing if you're a competitive runner to look for every possible competitive advantage. So there's a kind of natural curiosity there to say, how are these things constructed? What is the latest technology? And, I was kind of growing up at a time when Nike was just coming to the forefront, along with a few other brands. New Balance was coming up with technologies and introducing new types of foam. And I was naturally very, very curious about what the possibilities are. How do you push the limits of performance? And also injury prevention. Some of being a good athlete is staying injury free. So understanding the balance between pushing the levels of performance and also making sure that you do stay injury free. So that's everything from daily training to cutting edge racing shoes. So I think I was naturally curious about that. And I had the opportunity after I graduated from college. I was kind of pursuing my running habit and racing hard all over the world. I had friends that were taking jobs overseas at that time, which is where the running shoe industry was going. They were rapidly developing in places like Korea and Taiwan. And, I was very curious about that. So I had an opportunity to go over and become a young developer and learn about it. And my initial role was really in communication side. I didn't really know technically too much, but I found I could add a lot of value just by communicating back and forth between what I was seeing on the ground of the factories and what they were facing for challenges and opportunities, and then what design in the US was asking for. So being able to kind of bring those together. And in that process, just continually asking questions and asking for explanations, problem solving, that's how I sort of learned and became pretty exciting. So I spent the first part.
Yeah, I was going to say this is now over with Reebok in China, correct?
Correct. Yeah. So I actually started out in Korea, which is where a lot of the industry owners are still located today. I spent 3 years in Korea and then 3 years in Taiwan. And that was pretty interesting because culturally, those areas are different and they're still the titans of the industry. Most of the ownership today, factories in China, in Indonesia, and in Vietnam, which is where the vast majority of branded athletic products are made, are still owned by the owners from those two countries. So it was very helpful, again, culturally to understand it. If you look at the business models and the way they're set up, they're quite different. So if you look at things like vertical integration was the way Korea early on started to pull product away from Taiwan. Taiwan, it was sort of interdependent, interconnected businesses, much as you would have seen in Japan and the way they operate. So two different business philosophies, both very successful, but also, you learned a lot about how those products went together. And in my case, ultimately, as a developer, I started to become curious as to why the prototypes that I developed that look so great would ultimately get changed in production. So you started to get a little bit curious about the production process and, understand where the gaps are between what you can make as a prototype and then maybe ultimately the process capability in production, which might not meet the ability to produce with that same degree of precision that you can do in development. So what are the compromises you need to make? Or on the other hand, where can you dig in on the production side and say, how do we attack those production process capabilities to try to get to the next level?
So did that experience give you an incredible leg up, or at least equip you for what your company and many American manufacturers are facing now with the tariffs and what's going on with the Trump administration? And you've operated and you've competed over in Asia. You spent a lot of time there. How's that helped you help your company manage through the issues that most companies are now facing?
Sure. Yeah, I think it has. I think New Balance is very proud of our tradition of making product in the US. And, I joining New Balance also, I also had an appreciation. I joined New Balance about 15 years ago. So I had about 28 years in Asia before coming over. And basically, the combination of the culture that New Balance brings in terms of appreciation for its workers, dedication to high efficiency in the US factories, and then the understanding of how things are manufactured in Asia definitely has helped me. And again, we can apply a lot of our core values that are really instilled in us for the US manufacturing in Asia. But I mean, in terms of the unique challenges that we're facing now with tariffs, probably the biggest single advantage is we know that our factories in the US are highly efficient. And even with that, it's sometimes a bit challenging. So even with the increasing tariffs, I think it's still going to be a subset of our total business because the costs of manufacturing in the US are still high. The biggest single challenge in the US is still around the infrastructure. And I think there's an open question about how much more can we do in the US? How much can we bring infrastructure back to the US to help drive our manufacturing here? And then the other thing that's very important in our industry is scale. In Asia, of course, we have massive scale, and that means we can export globally from Asia with a low labor cost and with massive scale. So the manufacturing that we bring back to the US is still probably going to be mainly focused on US for the US market. And by definition, although it's a big market, probably 35% of the global market, so a massive share, it's still somewhat limited in terms of, if you're comparing it to global scale. So I think we are positioned pretty well to try to weather the tariffs. We have a diverse sourcing program, but there's no question that these new tariffs, There's still lots of questions on them. We're still trying to understand the full impact and then adjust accordingly.
If you could, just going back on what you said about the challenges and the open question on infrastructure, just unpack that a little bit. What aspects of infrastructure? Is it
right?
Is it physical plants? What aspect of it?
Now, when we think about infrastructure in the industry, it's probably a little bit different to what the term normally means. So if you are a sourcing guy and you're thinking about infrastructure, you might be thinking about ports and shipping and logistics. For my industry, really, I'm thinking about the pipeline of materials, raw materials, and components that need to come in. And again, in our industry, these are highly specialized. So you have polymer experts, injection molding experts. And again, in our industry, it's quite challenging. If you think about making a mobile phone or a car, typically you're going to make many, iterations of the same thing in one size, maybe one color or a couple of colors. In our industry, automatically, as soon as we introduce a new model, it has a lifespan of typically 3 to 5 months. Some, of course, will go on longer, but we have to build tooling for size and widths. And the size and widths might mean 39 different molds for just one single new product. And we introduce thousands of products every year. So it's quite complex and quite specialized. When we're thinking about building that knowledge and infrastructure for catering to that, if you have the global scale in Asia where they are, buzzing through dozens of brands and exporting globally, it becomes a little bit more challenging when you try to bring it back to the US. So again, we do have some good suppliers here and we do have a good infrastructure here, but again, it's somewhat more limited. And with the pace of change, scale is just super important because if you think about what we touched on before about something like molds, we're going to be doing more 3D printed molds as opposed to EDM molds. That technology is rapidly iterating in Asia. So they can buy a machine and then they quickly buy the next generation of the next generation because they're amortizing that very quickly. If we buy a machine here at smaller scale, it takes us longer to amortize. So it's hard for us to kind of keep up necessarily. So those are just practical challenges. They're not insurmountable, but those are some of the infrastructure challenges that we might be reviewing.
You touched upon this before. You have vendor relationships that span the globe. And I think I read 24 different countries and hundreds of different vendors, many of whom were classified as critical vendors to you. You got a lot of experience managing vendors in Asia and other places. Now being here with New Balance, which prides itself in manufacturing here in the US in large part. Tell me about your strategy in managing vendors, not just here, but a real diverse portfolio of vendors.
Sure. Yeah, that's right. And just to be clear, I actually don't have oversight over our U.S. manufacturing. I do help support them in terms of our global materials infrastructure. So we support them with some select materials, but a lot of it, more and more, has been brought back to the U.S., which is great. So my main role is looking at the international business. And again, a lot of that is just practical, being closer to market and being able to leverage that global scale that I mentioned before.
So how much time do you spend overseas?
Probably 10 to 12 weeks a year overseas, typically in Asia. We also have manufacturing in places like Brazil and Turkey. So I get a chance to travel internationally. And yeah, I just came back from a trip to Asia a couple of weeks ago, so I'm still getting over the jet lag. But I'm often on airplanes and trying to keep up. I have great teams over there, but I want to make sure that I'm seeing firsthand. When you see the scale of investment that some of our partners are making with us, it's not the kind of thing that you can see on a webcam. You really have to walk around and get a sense for the layouts of these plants and also their location or co-location with key vendors. So yeah, I do spend a lot of time over there interacting with the team. And yeah, I always love the chance of getting over there and getting my fingers onto what's happening over there. But in terms of how we manage it, if you think about it, I mentioned earlier that really we have specialized production. And so we're not typically doing strategic purchasing in the traditional sense where we're, going through a 5-step process and we're looking at, hey, how do we make sure that we're not paying too much for commodities? There's an element of that, But a lot of it has to do with working with these highly specialized suppliers, understanding what they can offer, and then making sure that we're working in a collaborative way so that we can hit price points. And the price points, if you look at the way we have to approach that, ultimately the consumer is going to decide what's an acceptable price point for a feature. So our role is to go in there and work collaboratively with the suppliers and say, look, this is the situation, we would like to include that feature in our product. If we can hit a certain price point, then we're going to hit a sweet spot and the volume really opens up. In rare cases, if it's a truly cutting edge technology, it's a high price technology, we might just say, well, it's going to be limited to a very small subset, and we can start with that, provide that benefit, say for our very, very top tier athletes, and then look down the road to make that scalable. But it's really about managing that. And part of the thing that's also important for us is to have category experts. So we have experts in textiles, experts in leather, experts in injection molded components and other sole technologies, whether it's rubber or foam. And again, it's very, very important that our sourcing is tied into those experts and that we kind of avoid going too much in the direction of commoditization of those, because it really is highly specialized.
You mentioned in these interviews, when I ask people about, so what technologies are really changing the face of sourcing and procurement, whatnot, it goes to AI immediately. But I know this because I actually know a company over in Italy that is a leader in 3D printing, and some of their biggest customers right now are in the foot apparel business and footwear business, and using 3D printing to make the molds, to first sort of prototype it, and then moving forward. I think it's fascinating. I don't think, we all hear about how 3D printing is out there, but not a lot of people see it really being used to really make the process more efficient.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, so that's a great example of new technology that's evolving. And again, as is sort of typical for our industry, we often see the early movers in automotive and electronics, and then it gets to a point where it's cost effective for us to adopt that. As I mentioned earlier, we have a unique challenge. I talk to my friends who are in the automotive industry or something, and I'm saying, you guys only have to make one mold, for that car. You have to make 39. So, it's a little bit of a joke. And then there's also an element of reality to that, which is that our industry, sometimes people underestimate the complexity associated with that, particularly on the software side. So 3D printing has now gotten to the point where the computer software is good enough so that they can, what we call grading, which is basically saying, I'm going to start from a prototype size, which might be a women's 7.5 might be my prototype size. Then I have to scale it up and down so I can do anything from, a women's 4.5 to a women's size 12. So that grading may sound simple, but it's not like making a square box. It is something that has to fit the morphology of a foot. There's a little bit of art as well as science into that. And now what's happening is the technology is getting to the point where we can do that, and we can make molds really, really effectively that are going to fit great and, fit our uppers and fit the complexity of taking a last, which is the foot form that we use. And then we wrap materials around that last, and then we're attaching the soles to that. So the mold has to fit that, highly specialized upper, and it has to fit a variety of uppers. We might put a variety of designs on that mold. So yeah, we are getting to that point, and it's pretty exciting. Molds are, if you've been to traditional mold shops, and again, I'm sure there are viewers out there that have been to traditional mold shops for all kinds of industries, and it tends to be a very heavy, a lot of moving steel up and down with lifts and trying to use EDM, spark erosion, and fluid that is cooling it. And it's a messy process. So 3D printing is beautiful. It's silent and it's quiet. And you have these beautiful, clean machines, and they're just building the molds very rapidly. So speed is a big advantage. So the cost is a little higher for some of those molds, but speed is an advantage. And to give you an idea of where the technical challenges are, the materials that we use to make 3D molds are different. So you have to think about things like heat conductivity, cooling ability, because the materials that we are making with these molds have to be heated and cooled at different rates. And sometimes those materials, new materials, are ideal, and sometimes they're not. So it sort of changes the way we do things, and we have to keep up with that. And we have experts that are out there with their finger on the pulse, trying to figure out what does this mean. The other thing is 3D printed molds. They have technically it's like putting a puzzle together, but you have different angles. So the way what a 3D printed mold can do is they can create undercuts, which you couldn't do in traditional mold making. And again, sometimes that's an advantage. We can do really cool shapes that we couldn't do with traditional molds, and sometimes it doesn't work because the mold ultimately has to open and may or may not be able to clear that undercut. So there's sort of limits to what we can do with design. And those things are fascinating, a lot of fun.
I think that stuff is so cool. You also mentioned price point. And, the folks I've spoken to now over the last couple of years, especially when we focus on or talk about the pandemic and how it changed the role of, head of supply chain, head of procurement, because all of a sudden these guys were the most important guys in the room when we had the supply chain disruption. And that certainly had an impact on the role of the average CPO, EVP of supply chain, you name it. You mentioned hitting a price point. And in your business, when all of a sudden, decisions made that you're going to come out with a new sneaker, and it's going to be whoever the celebrity is or the athlete that's going to endorse it, and there's going to be a price point for that sneaker. Well, you better be involved in that conversation because they've got a very specific idea of what they want this sneaker to be able to do and what they want in terms of performance. And that all then translates into who you're going to get as your supplier, at what price you're going to get for the components of that sneaker. Tell us about you being involved in that process. At what point, at what stage do you get consulted?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned that my team in Asia is responsible for kind of on the receiving end of the tech packs that design development in headquarters sends out. We actually have a number of design development facilities globally, but they will send it in. And so my team has to evaluate that immediately to say, hey, what kind of price point do we need to hit? At the macro level, we're constantly reviewing costing trends, labor trends, efficiencies, and our goal is driving lean efficiency so that we're continuously offsetting what we know are inevitable labor increases. So as long as I've been in the business, labor rates have been going up steadily, and that's as it should be. In the developing countries, in particular where we work, costs of living are going up, but also standards of living is going up. So we view that as kind of inevitable, and it's a little bit of a race for us to say, can we technically stay ahead of it? And we can do that through automation to some degree. And we can also do it through leaning out of the process. So lean is a very important element in whether we're able to move. Sometimes our industry is viewed from the outside as kind of a race to the bottom and you're just chasing the cheapest possible labor. I think the strongest argument against that is the major manufacturing countries that we're in now simply are not the lowest cost labor areas in the world. So if it was purely labor, we might be operating elsewhere. But I think it is an important element. It's still a very labor intensive industry. So what we try to do is continually improve. And I think the role of automation has been less critical. I won't say it will be less critical, but I think up until now, it's been less critical than understanding the end-to-end process and trying to drive out waste from that end-to-end process. So, yes, as we look at the macro level about costing and look what's happened, if we look over the past 30 years, the retail prices globally have remained surprisingly stable. And I think that's a tribute to the fact that the industry is driven pretty hard to become more efficient. The scale of the industry continues to grow in a healthy way. So that, again, that scale helps us maintain our prices. And that's been a pretty successful equation. I think we're entering maybe a new era now because the tradition of Asia being a low-cost center of manufacturing for developed markets in Europe and the US is starting to change. First of all, you're starting to see tariffs enter the picture, but also you're seeing Asia. So China, obviously, but also Greater Asia and India coming up as very significant markets. So ironically, the onshoring and nearshoring to the most important markets, a lot of that is actually happening in Asia as those industries grow. So for China manufacturing, and then increasingly India for India, or near China and near India is still where there's a big vortex. So those are all things that we're taking into account as we look at our costing and our pricing and what the outlook is.
So we're running out of time here, but I wanted to ask you, you're with such a diverse background with the role that you're in now, and the impact that you have on the final product. When you are talking to students who are, they're taking this, maybe they're majoring in supply chain management, and they're asking you, so the industry has changed, it's evolved, technology is so important now, data is so important. I know when I talk to, I'm a lawyer by trade, and I'll tell any law student that I do a lot at law schools, absolutely take business courses to understand, the financial aspects of whatever it is that whatever practice or discipline you go into. When you talk to students coming out of supply chain programs, what do you tell them that in addition to their core curriculum, they should also be getting training in?
That's a great question. I think that if I think about things that are really influential in terms of my day-to-day decision making, a lot of it has to do with objectivity, maintaining your objectivity. So you can be trained technically and you can be certified as a planner and you can understand all of the things that you need to do. But I mean, a large part of it is when you approach problem solving in a methodical way, try to remain objective. And again, that may sound easy, it may sound obvious, but it is something that is very, very powerful because sometimes you're so eager to get to a completion and finish that product that you bring your own natural biases into that. So, interestingly, I find people that, in myself, I was, oddly enough, I was an English major with the intention to be a lawyer. And
you made the right decision.
yeah, people sort of say, how did you end up in this business? My dad worked at MIT and he was more of the engineer, so I probably picked that up from him. But I think the objective kind of arts and sciences ethics training is also very, very important. I've been fortunate to travel all over the world to literally probably over 50 countries and see how manufacturing works. And what I've seen is the interplay between government conditions, but also how important the company culture is and your approach. So that objectivity is really important. And then also an ethical foundation. You can't expect your suppliers to operate in an ethical way if you're not leading by example. But more important, by treating people with respect, you're going to get their best, but also they're going to be speaking up and be honest about what their challenges are. And that's the key to effective, quick problem solving. So I think that's an important element in addition to the block and tackle work that they're no doubt getting in their business MBAs.
I got to tell you, I've asked that question to probably 20 different guests. That's the most unique answer I've gotten. And it tells me that we're going to do a part 2 to this interview because I didn't get to half the questions I had here. And I'd love to pick this up and have a part 2. But this was great. I really, really enjoyed this discussion. I've been a sneaker geek from, I don't know, probably 6 years old, which probably is when sneakers were, and I'm serious. My first high top Converse All-Stars were just, man, I was one of the first kids to get them.
That's awesome.
One of the first, but I saw others getting them. And I'm like, I had to get them because I was, I played sports and ever since then, I probably overspent on sneakers, and it fascinates me to see the ones that have come and gone, and then the ones who stayed and been resilient, and then, sort of rebrand themselves and make a resurgence. And New Balance has certainly been a major player since 1906. So it's fantastic. And I really enjoyed this conversation.
Great. Well, likewise, John. Yeah, I hope we can pick it up again in the future. It's a dynamic area and lots of changes. So be very happy to circle back.
That's great. So, so all of our listeners and viewers, thank you for joining us. And I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Smarter Sourcing. This has been John Pavia. Thank you.